My name's Aziz Sheikh, and it's my privilege to be kicking off this global debate on health information technology, HIT, and its regulation. And in this short presentation, I'm going to be arguing for the motion. That is, that I believe that current regulation is adequate. But before I get into the thrust of my argument, I want to tell you a bit about me and my background and my work. So I'm an academic physician by background. I've trained in general practice or family medicine in the UK. And practiced in this area for a number of years before moving into working as a hospital-based physician, where I've been practicing as a paediatric allergist. So I have backgrounds both in primary care and secondary care and using HIT in these settings. In terms of my academic interests, they lie in relation to HIT and the interface with patient safety considerations, attempts to improve the quality of care and the efficiency of care. And much of this work has been pretty applied. It's been focused on health services research considerations. But of late, I've been working particularly at the interface with health policy, and that's absolutely fascinating. I thoroughly enjoy that work. Much of my academic work has been in the UK, but I do have some experience of working in the US. I've recently returned from a stint in Boston working on a Harkness Health Policy Fellowship. And so I have some experience of the challenges in the US, and I will be drawing on some of these in the course of my presentation. Now, the reasons why I'm arguing for the motion are in essence threefold. The first is that, I think the evidence base points to the fact that HIT can impact on safety considerations, but the reality is that there isn't any sort of large-scale evidence of an epidemic of iatrogenic harm associated with HIT. So I want to summarise that evidence base. Secondly, I want to place a regulatory or a legislative approach within the wider scheme of things, so the wider policy tools that are available to policymakers in terms of trying to really realise the potential of HIT. And the third point I want to make is that regulation and legislation can be well intended, but it can unfortunately, and it often does, have unintended consequences, and we really need to think these through before really pursuing greater regulation and pursuing the development of more legislation. So the first point, colleagues will perhaps be aware that I have for a number of years been summarising the international evidence on HIT and its impact on the quality and safety of care. And I'll be the first to admit that whilst there is enormous potential, quite often this is not being realised. The challenges are largely in relation to limited functionality that quite often doesn't meet the needs of frontline physicians. There are challenges with usability, there are socio-technical issues about how this can interface with workforce deliberations on clinical workflows. So there's plenty of scope for development in that respect. And certainly, this can sometimes lead to professional frustration. It can lead to poor patient experiences. And there are certainly some cases where patients have come to harm. But if I reflect just on general practice in the UK, for example, where we have been digital for the last at least 15 years, this is a place where 90% plus of all healthcare interactions take place. Use of electronic health records, clinical decision support tools is routine. Electronic prescribing is part of day-to-day care involved in. These tools are used in millions of consultations a year. And whilst there are frustrations, certainly, there is no large-scale evidence of any epidemic of HIT-associated iatrogenic harm. So I think it's really important that we don't over-egg the argument. Moving to the second point, and that is that we already have a raft of regulatory and legislative approaches. So, for example, in the UK, we have the Medicine Healthcare Regulatory Agency, the MHRA. In the European Union, we have legislation there. In the US, we have the FDA, the FCC, the ONC, all of which have relevant regulations or legislations, all designed to enhance the safety of HIT devices or software. These are carefully thought through. They're important developments that have taken place over a number of years and have led, I firmly believe, to HIT being deployed in the best possible way, as far as possible. Added to that, we also have legislation around data protection considerations. So, for example, in the UK, we have the Data Protection Act. In the US, there is the Privacy Act associated with HIPAA. There are similar developments, similar regulations and legislation in many other countries, because privacy of patient data, ensuring confidentiality is absolutely crucial to ensuring trustworthy use of data, and so this is really important. And so, I think there is regulation around devices in some countries. There's certainly regulation around algorithms, software. There's regulation around data privacy already in place, a number of regulatory bodies. And I think what we need to do is be very careful about adding to that range of regulatory approaches. What we don't want is duplication. We don't want to overburden the industry such that what this does is it stifles innovation. And this is the third point that I want to come to, that legislation, regulation, well intended, can often result in unintended consequences. And I think the main concern here I have is that if innovation is stifled, if the regulatory bar is so high that new entrants can't enter into the marketplace, what this will do is it will really stifle competition. And what we actually need at this point in time is that we need new entrants. We need more dynamism in the vendor marketplace. We need this competition because what this will do is it will force innovations in new directions. Some of it may well be quite disruptive innovation. What we want are I don't think more regulation is the answer. Rather, there are a number of other approaches that we can use. So, for example, there are best practice guides. So there are the SAFER guides, which my colleague Dean Sittig will be talking about, I'm sure, in the course of his presentation in due course. Some really well-constructed tools that are out there trying to promote best practice. Similarly, in the UK, we've been developing the Primary Care Safer Practice Toolkit. There are similar developments taking place through the World Health Organization. So the sharing of best practice, for example, we need much more research focused on safety considerations. Ideally, we should have centres of excellence focusing on the interplay between HIT and safety, certainly in the developed nations and also in the emerging transition nations. So we need critical mass focusing on these issues. So sharing of best practice, really sort of catalysing research, incentivising the sharing of experiences. So, for example, if there are HIT-associated threats, vendors should be encouraged to share those, pool those experiences in a central database so we can all learn from those. Now, that doesn't necessarily need a regulatory approach. It doesn't necessarily need new legislation. What would be far better if we can try and create a moral mandate, sort of make it morally incumbent on vendors to share this information, because at the end of the day, this is, what we all want. We all want this HIT to be actually be used to improve patient care, patient experiences, drive up standards of care. So, in summary, I think HIT has a lot to offer. Much of that potentially is still not being realised, but more regulation and legislation is not really going to help us in that respect. What we want are far greater partnerships between the academics, the vendors, the providers and professionals. We need co-creation models. We need the sharing of best practices. We need sort of voluntary databases being created. And a range of similar approaches which are non-punitive, but which don't stifle innovations, don't stifle that creative urge that we have. And I think if we can pursue that approach, then we can really sort of begin to realise the potential of health information technology. And so, in conclusion, colleagues, what I'd recommend you to do is to look at the very carefully constructed FEDACIA report on health information technology, which is chaired by the chair of this debate, David Bates. And I think what I would certainly do is concur with the conclusions of that report, that it's not more regulation, more legislation that we need, but rather we need to use other approaches that make the most of human creativity and pursue a more partnership-based approach going forward. So in summary, colleagues, I'd really urge you to support the motion. I'm very grateful for your time. Thank you for listening.